All right, we're here. We're online. We're live. It's a go. Welcome back. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Okay, we are in Daniel. And we're going to go to verse 15. And before we pick that up, let's have a word of prayer and then we'll jump right in. Father, we're grateful tonight for the chance to be together. We're thankful that we have a building that we can come into that keeps us sheltered from the elements. But most importantly, Father, we're thankful that we have your word in our hand and that we can take the time to discuss it, to study it, and to learn from it. And for that to happen, your Holy Spirit has to be present. I know he is. Then he also has to have permission to come into our hearts and our minds, and so he can speak to us about what this is about. And we pray that tonight. We ask him to do that for us so that we might be enriched and inspired in Jesus' name. Amen. Chapter 1, verse 15. We left off last week where they had a good report. Daniel and the three boys were in better shape than everybody else. And God doesn't spend much time giving us the ins and outs and all of the minute details of what's going on. He just gives us the results of that. And one of the things that I hope that you see from this is that when it looks like on the surface that we are going through things and we are doing things and things are happening in our life, in reality, God is in control of this situation. And the results of these boys, their health from this diet that they were on, can only be harmonized by understanding that it was God that did it. And in our world, our history revolves around influential people, not us. That means that good things might occur, but bad things will occur. Because when influential people are involved, not many of them are good. And so you've got bad things that happen. And when we perceive that the working of God overrules the bad things that can happen, then we get to see God, and he comes to the forefront. And I want you to think about, God was going to use Moses as one of the most influential and powerful leaders of Israel. But if his sister Miriam hadn't come in and found a wet nurse, his mom, that would have been squelched. You've got a giant who is defying the armies of Israel. And if God hadn't led a young shepherd boy to that battle, number one, Goliath would not have been defeated, and David would never have been recognized. Then you've got this guy who's just out plowing a field, and by following Elijah, he's granted a double portion of that prophet's power and ability. And then, of course, one of the most amazing ones is all, Luke writes about this in Acts, and we slip over this so often. As Stephen was being stoned, there was a young man watching that who was holding the coats of the men that were stoning him. His name was Saul. God changed that to Paul. Inner workings that sometimes we overlook, God can suddenly and decisively change things. And he does. When those 10 days were completed, any failure of that would have cost Ashpenaz his life, and so he was really concerned about it. And we talked last week about the fact that these servants, they had to keep their mouths shut, only in terms of speaking, for all of that time, 3 years. But they kept their mouths open because they were eating the best food they'd had ever. The chef was fixing meals just for them. Wow. For 3 years, those guys went to work smiling because that was one of the best gigs in Babylon, to get to eat that food. And so I want you to see this, how God works. It wasn't the result of a good diet. It was the result of God. He doesn't get glory if we think that this diet was extra special. God doesn't get glory just because the sun shines. He does get glory when it stands still or goes back in time. People can dig a well out in the desert and get water. God doesn't get glory from that. He does get glory when a man speaks to a rock and water comes out of that. God gets glory from that. God receives glory when the extraordinary comes from the ordinary. And when a widow fixes a meal, her last meal, for a prophet, and she fixes that last meal every single day for a year, God gets glory for that. And so at the end of 10 days, see where it says that in verse 15? At the end of 10 days, Daniel and his friends had an at-the-end mentality. They lived for the time when they would be examined. And the church has lost that mentality. I see it so many times. The loved one has now passed on. And now they're thinking about the end time. What's happened to them? Where did they end up? We should live every day understanding, because these boys did. At the end of 3 years, they were going to be examined, and so they lived every day with that expectation. We should live every day with the expectation that at the end, we're going to be examined. The things that we've done and the things that we've said. And Except that our examination isn't going to come from Nebuchadnezzar. Our examination is going to come from God. What? Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, he was thinking about God. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I don't know if, because Ashpenaz didn't know what was going on, but Melzar did. He was the guard to the servant. I don't know if he thought about what was happening, because he was on the inside. And he was watching this diet, and he was watching these boys, and he saw the difference in their life. I don't know, but lest we give him too much credit, we need to remember that he was only doing this because he was worried about his own skin. He was real concerned about what they were eating and how they was affecting them, because the difference would be at the end, his life was in jeopardy. And okay. So, chapter 4, lesson 4. Are you ready, Susie? Daniel 1, would you read verses 17 through 21, please?
Daniel 1?
Yep, 17 through 21.
Sorry, I can't see it. Can you read it?
Would you read it, Norm?
Sure. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every manner of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus.
These verses talk about the fact that God's involvement is sovereign. But what we need to remember from the get-go is there is a clash here between the king's requirements and Daniel's commitment to God. The king knows nothing at this point in time about Daniel not following orders. It doesn't matter that the king doesn't know. Daniel knows. And he's not really worried about the king. He's worried about God. So he is in direct violation. And that happens in our lives. And one of the things that troubles Christians, especially today, is that we have this that confusion that exists among church people who imagine that God has abandoned them because nothing seems to be working out for them. They have one bad thing happen after another, and in their mind, they're thinking, well, if God really loved me, I wouldn't ever have bad things happen. And they also think that if I get on the prayer chain and I have people start praying, then true faith is going to resolve this problem in a short while. I mean, you can watch a television show and they can solve the crime in an hour. If God's more powerful than TV, then why can't he solve my problems in an hour? Or at least a day, or at least a week, or even a year? But when he doesn't, we immediately think, well, something's wrong with me. God must not care for me anymore. And here, they continued this regimen for 3 years, and we don't have a resolution until we get into the next chapter, but patience in God's promise are the things that we struggle with the most. And so just a reminder here, turn back to Genesis chapter 12. This is a real good example. Genesis chapter 12. Plus, it might give you guys a chance to, open your mouths and actually answer a question. So, Nicole, would you read the first 4 verses of Genesis 12, please?
The Lord said to Abram, "Go out from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you."
And 4.
Whoops. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran.
Yeah, that's it. So, God gives this promise to Abraham. And what was the promise? That what?
To make him a great nation.
He would become a great nation. What else?
He would be blessed.
He would be blessed. Chuck?
All the families of the earth will be blessed.
And all the families of the earth would be blessed. That's a pretty big blessing.
That's all.
Yeah, that's a big promise. He's 75. And one of the things that might have stuck in his mind when God said, "I'm going to make you a great nation," was what? He didn't have any kids. Really tough. Really tough to be a big nation when you don't have any children. So, go to Genesis chapter 15. Genesis chapter 15. And Sally, would you read verse 2?
Abram said, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus."
Yes. So Abraham thought who was going to be the heir? His slave. Well, that would create a little bit of trouble with the great nation part, but I mean, God's going to bring everybody in. So I don't know if Eliezer was married or not, but he thought, well, maybe he'll have kids. Okay, go over to Genesis chapter 16. Sally, first 3 verses, please.
Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but he had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife.
And then read verse 16.
16.
16, yeah. Do you have verse 16?
Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born.
Yes. So, he obviously had talked this over with his wife, and she said, there's got to be something wrong with you, Abraham, because we're not having any kids. And so she has a suggestion. And how old was Abraham then? 86. So he's been waiting for God to answer the promise. 11 years has gone by. Now, that's quite a while to wait, isn't it? I mean, if you were waiting for an answer, wouldn't 11 years seem like a long time? Yeah, I get that. And then in Genesis chapter 17, Ishmael from Hagar has been born. And the end, do you want to read? No. Okay. Emily, would you read verses 15 and 16?
Then God said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her."
So, God shows back up and he says, guess what? Hagar wasn't the right one. I'm still going to give you a promise, and you're going to have a kid, and it's going to come through Sarah. Now, look at verse 17 and read that, Emily. 18. Read verse 18, Emily.
And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee."
Yeah, he said, wow, that's good. God, you got such a sense of humor. That is so funny. What's the problem? They're old. I mean, he's 86, for crying out loud. So, down to stay in 17, and Emily read verses 21 and then 24.
"But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year." Now Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin.
God comes back and he says, and he's even named the kid. God's named the kid. God says, you're going to have a boy, you're going to call him Isaac. And that's where the promise is coming through. And at 99 years old is when God shows up and tells him this. 24 years since the first time he promised him. That's a long time. 24 years. And then, Emily, verse 10 of chapter 18.
Your wife shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door which was behind them.
And we know the story. She started giggling. She said that. That's funny. Because my hubby is, he's 99. Have you seen him, God? Oh, boy. And then, verse 2 of chapter 21. Emily?
So Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his
not the first time in chapter 12, but the last time when he said within a year, you're going to have a baby. And that promise was a certainty. But he had to wait 25 years. And that's incredible until you think about many of the saints in the Old Testament never ever saw one of God's promises completed. How about, we'll go to Acts chapter 7. We were just talking about Stephen, Acts chapter 7. Because Abraham saw that, it took 25 years, but God also said all this land's going to be yours. Acts chapter 7. And Tony, would you read verse 5?
And he gave him no inheritance in it, not even a foot in the ground. Yet even he had no child. He promised that he would give it to him as a possession, and his offspring after him.
God promised him the land. Never. Stephen tells us never inherited it. What about Adam and Eve? You know, God came after their sin and said, you are going to have a baby. Your seed is going to redeem us. And she thought her firstborn was the one that was going to do it. And the seed, her seed, wouldn't come until 4,000 years later. Then Moses told the people that God had said to him he was going to raise up a prophet like Moses. That prophecy wasn't completed until 1,500 years later. Isaiah declared that a son was going to come into Israel, the Messiah was going to be born of a virgin, and that wasn't fulfilled for over 700 years. So these promises that God gives we just have to wait. And sometimes we never see the answer. And, oftentimes we'll pray for people who are sick, and we ask God to heal them. And if they're Christians, God always heals them. But sometimes not till they get to glory. And that's where they will be healed. I was just listening today on my way back from the cemetery. Alan Jackson sings a song, I want to stroll through heaven with you. Breaks my heart because then I think about my wife. And that day, what a day that will be when I get to stroll through heaven with her, because she'll finally be able to walk like we used to. That's God's promises, man. So he has these 4 gifted children, and to this point in Daniel, several details have been mentioned, and God's going to weave them into a tapestry. 8 particular people have been mentioned so far here in Daniel through the first chapter. Who are they? Daniel? Ding, ding, ding. We got a winner. There's one. Nebuchadnezzar. There's 3 of them right there. Ashpenaz. Jehoiakim. And Melzar. Yeah, Melzar. 5 groups of people have been mentioned in this first chapter. King Cyrus was mentioned in the first chapter?
Of Daniel?
Last verse.
Oh, tell the first year of Cyrus the king. Very good. Very good. Way to go, school teacher. Nice. Nice in there.
Extra credit.
Doesn't count. 5 groups of people.
Judah?
The children of Israel, I'll give you that one.
The Chaldeans?
The Chaldeans. It would be the king's seed. Yep. And then right along with that, there's a slash similar to that. They're not called the king's seed, but they were called what? Princes. Princes. And then the other ones that aren't, they may not have that name, but we know because of the way that they had these servants, they probably were who? Another name for the servants. They were in the king's court. They had a special designation.
The Secret Service?
No, they were eunuchs. Eunuchs. And then 6 significant places were mentioned in that first chapter. Come on.
Jerusalem,
Jerusalem,
Babylon,
Babylon.
Judah,
Where?
Judah,
King of Judah. Okay. And right in that same verse 2, there's a place.
Land of Shinar?
That would be Babylon. Where were the vessels? Where were the vessels?
Temple of God,
The house of God. Yep. And then where else?
Babylonia,
We mentioned that one. So you've got the house of God, and you've got 2 other houses. The treasure house of Nebuchadnezzar's God, and then just the house of Nebuchadnezzar's God. And those items that they talk about in that first chapter are what? What were they drinking? What were they? Yes, the vessels of the house of God. And then what were they eating? What was the chef making? The chef was making not veggies. Yes, the king's meat and the king's wine. And then Daniel and the 3 boys were eating vegetables, pulse, and drinking water. Okay. And even though all those things are in there, Nebuchadnezzar's not the point. Ashpenaz and Melzar are not the point. The city of Babylon isn't the point. And the number of the children of Israel isn't the point. It's Daniel and these 3 boys. That is the point. And God is going to use these 4 boys. And where are they at? Because we often think that in our given situation, we have to be in a particular place. God can't use me because I'm here. God can't use me because I'm there. I have, over the years, I've had people tell me, you know, I've got to quit my job, or I've got to leave my wife, or I've got to leave my husband, or I've got to leave my state because God can't use me here. And where were these boys? They were captives. They had been conquered. They were in an ungodly situation. And You may be in oppression, but I'll tell you, you are not apart from God. He can use you wherever you are. Circumstances are no hindrance to him. When God gives a gift to you, nothing can thwart that from being used. God can always use you because he doesn't give you a gift unless he's got something specific in mind for you to use it on. And think where they were. Talk about feeling like you probably were outside of God's will. The judgment of God had fallen on the nation of Israel. He had sent prophet after prophet to say, you've been disqualified. I don't want you worshiping me anymore. Remember, through Jeremiah and Ezekiel, God said, stop praying to me. I'm not listening. Wow. Wouldn't you feel like, I'm not sure God's going to want to use me? He said, I don't want to hear you. They had been removed from their homeland. The temple had been destroyed, what they'd put all their faith in. The vessels that they thought were so sacred were now in Nebuchadnezzar's God's house. And the children that had been hauled away were in a heathen place. Ungodly teachers. And this is if God could grant these four the ability to do these amazing things, he can use every one of us here in this room tonight. And circumstances, your background, it doesn't matter. These four children were exposed to the Babylonian wisdom, language, literature. It involved idolatry, magicians, astrologers, sorcerers, soothsayers, spiritual falsehood, corruption. And these four were untouched by that environment. And one of the things, and it's too bad we don't have our entire congregation here, because one of the things that I hear all the time given as an excuse is, we've got to rescue our children from public school because of the environment that they're in. Hello. God didn't say, I'm going to have to get these four out of Babylon if I want to use them, because they're in a horrible atmosphere. I mean, what are they learning? And see, they can be in the midst of that, and God can still speak to their minds in such a way that they flourish. But I'm wondering how many of our parents, how many of our grandparents are really praying for our children in these schools, because we're thinking that it's the teachers that have the power and it's God that's got the power. Our kids can be in the middle of this ungodly pagan environment, and a lot of times it is. But that doesn't mean that they have to be influenced. God can take our children and our grandchildren and influence those pagan environments. That's what he did with Daniel and these three boys. Divine protection is still available. And our God is great enough, isn't he? That he can get into those schools and turn that thing around. but not if we've got milquetoast parents that just want to wring their hands and say, I can't afford Christian school. You don't have to. Get them into public school and turn them into evangelists. Have them speak up. Get their papers graded with Fs and then cause a stink about it. What do you mean? Because it wasn't long ago that a little girl, the teacher said, you can write a paper on any hero that you want. She wrote a paper on Jesus. And what made him her hero was dying on a cross, and the teacher failed her. Yeah. Parents marched right into that school, and they said, we want you to stand in front of the school board and say why you failed my child. Change the grade. Because these bullies are only bullies if they think they can get away with it. Yeah. Bullies are not really powerful. We give them the power. And our God is a lot more powerful than that. So Daniel excelled in all these areas. And I want you to see something. In verse 17, there's something here that we have a real problem, because if they were giving out trophies, they didn't do it fair. Because if they were giving out trophies, who got the trophy? That's in today's culture. Here in verse 17, who got the trophies? What? Daniel got it all. These four excelled, but Daniel excelled above them. Wait a minute. That's not right. Is it? Yeah. God decided it. And so then, our text in verse 18, he jumps ahead 3 years, and at the end of the days, that's a period of time. And we know it was 3 years because it says that back in verse 5. And here we have, again, in verse 18, this vision of what it will be for us. Because they were going to appear before the judgment seat. And I'm not sure if we grasp what kind of intimidation this was. Because they appeared before who? Nebuchadnezzar. Yes. Yes. Turn over to Jeremiah 27:7. Absolutely, Chuck. In fact, 27:7, God's going to tell you how powerful he was. In fact, let's start with verse 5. And Chuck, would you read verses 5 through 7?
I have made the earth, the men and the beasts which are on the face of the earth, by my great power and my outstretched arm, and I will give it to the one who is pleasing in my sight.
No, wait, stop right there. Through the prophet Jeremiah, God said, how much power do I have? I got it all. I have made everything. And what's he going to do? Give it to the one he chooses. Go on, Chuck.
Now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and I have given him also the wild animals of the field to serve him.
Okay, stop right there. We've got the most powerful in the universe. He said, I've got all of this, and I'm giving it to the one I please. And so far, he's given him what? All the land, all the animals. Now that's pretty powerful, wouldn't you say? Then finish it out, Chuck.
All the nations shall serve him and his son and his grandson until the time of his own land comes, that many nations and great kings will make him their servant.
Yes. Chuck said he was so powerful. Yeah, talk about power. God given him all the nations, all the land, all the animals. Egypt was a great nation at the time, and Nebuchadnezzar knocked him down. In fact, Egypt was given to Nebuchadnezzar. Remember when he tried to conquer Tyre and didn't do it? God said, you know, I should reward him for the effort. I know, I'll give him the empire of Egypt. You know, just a little incentive. Among the captives that Nebuchadnezzar had were the Phoenicians, the Syrians, the Egyptians, and the Jews. Nebuchadnezzar conquered almost all of Africa. His empire went all the way to Spain, all the way to India, up into Russia, and cleared down into the middle of Africa. His empire was larger than Augustus. And these boys are standing in front of him. Hello? Are you nervous yet? And the king communed with them. That wasn't a lecture. It was a two-way conversation. Hi, boys. Have you ever talked to kids that aren't yours? It's really hard to talk to them because they are just goofy. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to act. They hide behind their folks. And I know that these kids are teenagers, but sometimes it's hard to talk to teenagers, isn't it? You ever try to talk to teenagers? Wow. I don't know how Brady does it. Because they're just not normal. I mean, at the age of 12, they go into their bedroom, and then when they come back out, they're aliens. The only time you see them for the next 5 or 6 years is when it's time to eat. Then they show up, they scarf their food down, don't say thank you, and go back to their rooms. And if they are out in public, they have a thing in front of their face the whole time. Their heads are usually down, their thumbs are going like this. I don't know how they can walk. I had a service today, and after the service, we went to the cemetery, and there were 3 teenagers in the group. And the whole time the funeral was going on, I was looking back as other people came up and shared memories, and we had singing. And I looked, and the 3 teenagers had a device. They were on their phones. And when we got to the cemetery, we're outside, and they're still on their phones. That's where they live. So here you got these teenagers in front of the most powerful man in the world, and he says, how's it going? They're talking. And what he wants to find out from them is what? How intelligent. Beyond intelligence, what is he looking for? Yes, wisdom and a little word that starts with a K. Knowledge. What's the difference between wisdom and knowledge and intelligence? That was great. Say that just a little bit louder so we can all hear that.
Knowledge is knowing tomatoes are fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put tomatoes in fruit salad.
Isn't that good? That is awesome. Yes. The second half of verse 19, after he talked to them, and he's got this test that he's given, and he understands that they're not only capable of knowing the things that they should know, but they know what to do with that. And then, most importantly, he has seen by their demeanor in front of him that they can handle being in front of people. If they can stand in front of the most powerful man in the known world, they can certainly go back and stand among their constituents and get a hearing. And that's really important. That's so important. They chose to be different, and they wanted to honor God before the king, and so he rewarded them in that context. And I think that's... Oh no, let me just follow up with this. About who was in his realm. Do you see here in verse 20? He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and the conjurers. And I love this, especially because we live in a day and age where modern ministers are much too educated to believe in such things. But the magicians, these were the wise men of Babylonia. And they could practice magical arts, incantations, and they had the ability to do things that surpassed human power. My friend Ben Alexander, when I was able to have him at my house and we were able to speak, he talked about the days that he was a spirit medium in England. And one of the ways that him and his friend made their money, because they didn't make it at seances, the powers that be that owned these boys, they made the money. So they had this little shop that they had were renting out, and tourists would come in. And they had this, Americans especially were so gullible, and they would say, "Would you like to gamble?" And the Americans would always say, "Well, it depends." And so the boys said, "I'm going to stay out here with you, and my buddy is going to go in with one of your party." And they had a pub table there in this London shop, one of those high tables. And he says, "What we're going to have you do is you're going to go in and you're going to look at objects that we've got inside this room, and you're going to write down 10 things that you see. You're not going to tell them to my buddy. You're not going to share the paper. You're just going to write the 10 things down. Then your friend, my buddy, are going to come out, and he's going to hold on to the paper, and I'm going to go in by myself. Nobody else in there with me, so you know they're not whispering. And I'm going to write the 10 things that he wrote on his paper. And at the end, if we can match them up, then you'll owe us money. And if I can't, we'll pay you. Does that sound like a deal?" And the Americans would always say, "Yeah." When Jeff or Ben, it didn't matter which one, when they would go in by themselves, not only would they write down the 10 objects that this person, this American, wrote, but they would write them in the exact order. Because you see, the table was possessed. And the way that they could figure it out is they would go in there with the paper and they would make the table levitate, and it would go, and with one of its corners, it would point to the objects. And then Ben or Jeff would write them down. Because these people who practice the occult have powers that surpass human ability. That's why God said, I don't want you to have anything to do with them. Every single time they could make that table levitate, and it could point to the exact same objects that those people had written, because the table knew what they wrote. Now, obviously, that blows our mind. But these magicians were living in the age of Moses. And remember when he went into the king's court and he threw his staff down and it turned into a snake? And there are people still today, I mean Christian men and women with degrees behind their name, that will say that when the magicians did that, it was just a trick. They had these special kind of things that looked like snakes. Now, they were snakes because they had that power. And where would the lesson be when God is trying to prove to the Egyptian people that he's more powerful? How would that be any kind of a lesson if these guys weren't able to produce real snakes that Moses' snake ate? Oh yeah, Moses' snake can eat a fake snake. No. His snake could eat a real one. Oh my goodness. They could do so many of the same miracles that Moses could do, and then finally the lice came and they couldn't match that. And when they got to a point where they couldn't match those miracles, they said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." See, that's what God's after. So these magicians, these astrologers, they had different names: a necromancer, an enchanter, an exorcist. They were able to have these demons come up and impersonate human beings. They were able to do just amazing things. The last story I'll tell you, and I'll quit. Ben was in the room being groomed as this diviner, and he always would get cold because the lights would go out. And this voice said, "Ben, is that your teeth that are rattling?" And Ben said, "Yes." And immediately he had a fur coat on. And when the lights come back on, he looked and he knew exactly where that fur coat had come from. On his way up to the room, they had passed it 3 flights of stairs down, hanging on a hook. And that fur coat went from there to him wearing it in an instant. Because these occult people have power that surpasses human power, but is not as great as God's power. Thanks for coming.